Just mute yourself.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure in welcoming you all to the first webinar in DAG's-Urban Land and Housing Dialogue series. The overarching theme of this webinar is access to housing and land in the context of COVID-19. So thanks to all the participants who've logged in and who've made the time to attend this particular webinar. Just to say who's listening in, so we've got a fairly good mix of participants in the mix. We've got about 30 to 40% community representatives who've joined this call. We've also got a number of international agencies like the Habitat International Coalition, UN Habitat, that have joined this conversation, a number of civil society organizations that have joined this call as well, all over the country, and some of them based internationally. Also got a number of academics, practitioners that have joined the call, and some government officials as well. So just also a very warm welcome to all the speakers for making the time. So all the organizations that you've seen on the program, we welcome the speakers to again shed some light on key issues that have come forward in the context of COVID-19. So just in terms of protocols and the agenda, the first half of the session will be covering three issues, starting off with the urban land access and the release of state land. And in this context, we'll also be discussing issues related to evictions, tenure security, and dedensification. This will be followed by a Q&A session, and a brief poll will be included as part of the Q&A session. The second session will focus mostly on the access to basic services in informal settlements and the Asivic Elani campaign and public participation in the context of COVID-19. This session again will be followed by a Q&A session. There's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screens that you'll see. There's a pop-up box. You can pose questions to the speakers, and I invite you all to participate freely by adding your questions and comments for the speakers. We have two facilitators who will be taking down the various questions and also sharing those questions with myself so that it can be posed to the speakers as time allows it. There will be the final poll at the end of the conversation, at the end of the webinar, which we encourage you to please populate so that it gives us some guidance in terms of further themes as we go down further dialogues in this series. So just to perhaps give a little bit of context of where this particular dialogue and debate comes in place. So as many of you know, in March, President Ramaphosa declared a national state of disaster and a 21-day lockdown, which was subsequently extended. In addition to all the measures to prevent the spread and bolstering the healthcare system, everyone was expected to stay home, and in the instances they were out, to maintain social distancing and so on. So while the public health strategies such as social distancing and regular hand washing were encouraged, such strategies were necessarily a privilege that many couldn't afford in crowded informal settlements or backyards. And many of them did not have and do not continue to have access to running water. And this is the reality for about 4 million people who are living in approximately 3,000 informal settlements across the country, and many of the overcrowded housing stock and backyards. And obviously the risk that got magnified with the COVID-19 crisis was the loss of income, the food and nutrition crisis that was following, and of course, ultimately the access to proper healthcare. So while the virus does not discriminate on the basis of race, gender, or class, it will and has disproportionately affected the poor in the country. Now, clearly the economic impact on the poor and the vulnerable is devastating, and a team of researchers predict that the level of poverty for the vulnerable households is likely to triple in this particular context. And it's only going to worsen the existing inequalities and create new ones. Now, during this unprecedented times, obviously government departments, civil society organizations, and citizens have united in many different ways to fight the spread of the virus and protect those vulnerable from infection. We've seen the emergence, particularly in the Cape Town context, of community action networks and Cape Town Together that's been spearheading a lot of the food relief and PPE relief. At the national level, there's been quite a bit of significant coordination between civil society organizations and provincial and local governments around emergency response with regards to the delivery of basic services for informal settlements until level 4, a moratorium on evictions, and particularly measures put in place around delivery of water services and PPE to informal settlements and overcrowded conditions. However, despite this, part of the attempt at this particular dialogue series and this specific webinar is to really, that many of these responses have necessitated a coordinated approach between various stakeholders, whether it be government stakeholders, whether it be civil society organizations. And while many discussions have been held with government institutions, the real attempt of this webinar is to bring most civil society organizations, community-based organizations on the same page around access to land and housing in relation to COVID-19. So the aim of the webinar is really to share critical information and knowledge, and we've got excellent speakers that will speak to this. It is an attempt to improve alignment and greater coordination between various campaigns and coalitions that are working across the sector and across the country at the moment, some of them even operating internationally. And ultimately, the ambition, which probably won't be achieved through any single webinar or any single action, is to accelerate the response towards housing and land rights. And that's really the kind of broad aim of this webinar. As way of introduction, my name is Adi Kumar, and I am the Executive Director at Development Action Group. I'll be moderating the session and shaping this discussion as we go forward, and give a brief introduction in terms of kind of the context from which DAG is approaching this particular problem and setting the scene. So for some of you may know that DAG was formed in 1986, and it was born out of the resistance of the evictions in Crossroads. In the early years, DAG was heavily involved in supporting communities across the Western Cape against evictions and providing essential services to community-based organizations. Now, looking through our archives, two critical publications came to mind, one from 1991 and the other one from 1993, both of them relating to the theme of releasing well-located state land for affordable housing, and make specific mention to several parcels of land in Cape Town that were owned either by the South African Defence Forces or by the National Department. The other piece that was very interesting in these particular publications was the highlighting the relationship between the issue of land and well-located land and the people and the citizens living in those particular cities. It's been over 25 years since those publications, and we're still waiting for that land to be released, and we're still finding copies of archival material of when this particular process started. And as a consequence, that this land spatial and class divide in the city. So the question is, why now? Why is this so urgent to discuss this issue of releasing well-located land in the context of COVID-19? To be honest, COVID-19 has changed everything. The deep impact of the pandemic, the socioeconomic rights, the lack of shelter and response to overcrowded condition has come under the microscope dramatically. President Ramaphosa himself said there can be no greater injustice than a society where some live in comfort and plenty, while others struggle at the margin to survive with little or nothing at all. In acknowledging this, it isn't just a failure of the ideology, but of government and civil society together not being able to manage this particular process together. This is obviously supplemented, for many of you who heard the speech from the finance minister about 2 weeks ago, is the belt tightening that's taking place. There's going to be less money, there's going to be less resources available to deal with the crisis that we face ahead of us. And this crisis isn't going to go away in the short term. So the why now question again. What are we seeing in our cities? Why have urban areas become the center of the pandemic? Now, for those of you who well versed in this would know that 70% of South Africa's economy is driven through the metros. They are the hotspot in terms of the economy, but they're also the hotspot in terms of the pandemic because of the large disparities that exist in many of these urban areas and the cities. The highest number of informal settlements, overcrowded conditions, occupied building, and people generally living in poor quality shelters. Now, the social impact on the poor and informal traders has been staggering. We're hearing stories, and other speakers will recount, of people being evicted, the loss of jobs, the loss of income, and all of this is magnifying the spatial divide that pre-exists in the city, and it's making it even more stark. Now, as we move out of the pandemic and as we get closer to the peak, the highest cost of this pandemic is going to be borne by the poor, who are living on the periphery of the city. And as the peak hits, the issue of land is going to become even more magnified. So this question hasn't just popped up and has really been catalyzed due to COVID-19, but this is, like I mentioned earlier, a historical question. And part of this puzzle of the release of well-located land was really complemented in 2013 with the introduction of the spatial planning and land use regulations called SPLUMA. Now, the key principle in SPLUMA highlighted the issue of spatial justice and that critical ask that municipalities take spatial justice issue seriously, and that every development has some way contributes towards overcoming the spatial divide that we see in many of our urban areas. And then, of course, at the last election, we saw a big election campaign with the ruling party was the emergence of the expropriation without compensation, which is not materialized in any real terms, but contributes to the pressure that has built up on the issue of land. And then ultimately, of course, COVID-19 being one of the main catalysts here. Now, we're seeing the strongest response in terms of COVID-19 being led through civil society, both in food relief and mask making. And the question is this the opportunity where many organizations come together and rally, not just national, but provincial, local, and state-owned enterprises to make this land available for both the short-term response, but also for the long-term development for people. So this is a conversation that started between a few organizations like the Legal Resource Center in Ndafuna Kwasi, South African Slum Dwellers International, Development Action Group, Lawyers for Human Rights, and Professor Vanessa Watson from the University of Cape Town. And in a way, to really start the conversation, but put the call out and put the debate out in the public so that people who are interested in the issues of land and housing can relate to this issue and perhaps contribute in building a campaign towards this. The second piece, which is quite important, and I'll be very brief, is what land is suitable. And in this crisis, I think the debate has moved on from whose land it is, but to the fact that which land has to be made available through the particular release of state land. So in our view, any state-owned land that can provide relief efforts at the moment, whether it be national, provincial, local, or state-owned enterprise land, has to be released, which needs infrastructure, bulk infrastructure, and services, and as far as possible, adjacent and close to transportation and economic opportunities. Now, our colleagues at Reclaim the City and in Ndafuna Kwasi have also done some stellar work around the issues of sale and lease of land that has shed a very, very critical issue around the issue of land release, that it is the highest priority and has to be made the highest political priority going forward. National government over the recent responses has also spoken about de-densification, which is essentially highlighted to about 29 areas, and subsequently other areas can be, other informal settlements can be de-densified as well. And Charlton from South African Slum Dwellers International will speak to that particular issue. But the key issue again there being little or no public participation is happening around the de-densification issue, and it's really not moving in the very, very high density urban areas like Cape Town and Johannesburg. And there is generally a complete lack of transparency around the issues of land that is being prioritized, and the hindrances that block the release of land aren't being addressed at the moment. So we hope and maintain that there's a pipeline of land that can be released systematically, that any of these commitments to releasing land do not fall into the black hole of legal departments and procurement processes, but rather in the public realm, in the public courts, so that we can participate in the decision-making around the release of those particular lands. Now, the last question, and that's the last input I'll make and follow on with the other speakers, what should be done with this land? Now, just for a minute, imagine that if 3 parcels of land owned by South African Defence Services could contribute and wipe out and provide housing for 1/5 of the housing backlog in Cape Town, what could be done nationally if there was political will and force behind it? Now, this isn't just about releasing land in the old crafted ways around providing RDP and BNG houses. It is essentially about creating and deepening that relationship between land and people. A different form of social compact is needed to create much more integrated neighborhoods that can deal with the current crisis. And the current crisis under the Disaster Management Act finally allows us an opportunity to address both the immediate needs in the pandemic, but also the longer term entrenched patterns of spatial inequality. Now, this does require a very different form of urban management that needs to be fostered, a new form of partnership between citizens and community-based organizations and government institutions, so that this type of release can be linked not just to a developer-driven, large-scale mega project kind of a logic, but rather a clear plan for incremental self-built developments that can turn these sites over the long term horizon into mixed-use developments. Such developments could potentially transfer many of the public-owned lands into thriving neighborhoods that take us forward towards a spatially just city. So in conclusion, this is no longer a matter of choice. This is the highest necessity that we have at the moment. And if we have to address the short-term COVID-19 responses of the long-term issues, the issue of land and housing has to be addressed as a matter of urgency. So with those particular opening comments, I'm going to hand over to Mandisa, who's going to open up with the issue of evictions in the context of COVID-19. I'm just going to pull up her biography. So Mandisa is the Executive Director of Indefuna Okwasi. The organization's primary mission is to expand and protect access to affordable housing towards building a more equal and spatially just city. Mandisa founded the Indefuna Okwasi Law Center in 2015. Her practice areas support the organization's work on advancing urban land justice, including constitutional, property, housing law, and access to basic services. She has a UCT degree in political science and an LLB degree and an LLM in constitutional and administrative law with distinction. Mandisa was also announced as one of the Mail and Guardian's top 200 young South Africans in 2016. Mandisa, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. DAG and partners, thank you for the invitation to participate, and I think is a really important and topical issue around what to do with our urban land and housing crisis, something that's been with us for a while. And I agree with you wholeheartedly, Adi, that this presents an opportunity to not only think differently, but act differently going forward. As we anticipate this COVID pandemic being with us for a while, but also an opportunity to really shift how things have been for some time. Crises have historically shown that that is possible, and we really ought to use this opportunity to center the issues and act on them. I've been tasked with speaking about the legal protections around evictions and prompts and solutions going forward. But before I do that, I think it's just important to emphasize two key points that I think are critical in understanding our context. And that is understanding how it is that we got to be here, the problem that we are faced with. The first was alluded to in Adi's introductory remarks around landlessness. Landlessness is something that has shaped South African cities and towns throughout our history. In fact, probably one of the only common denominators of our history is, and a common in terms of that it cannot be disputed, is that we have a history of dispossession of many things, and land being at the heart of it. And so the creation and continuation of a class of people who are landless has really informed continuing and deepening urban inequality. And so if we are to really address issues, we need to understand how it is that people come to occupy land, continue to have insecure title to land, and are accordingly displaced, displaced and dispossessed of their homes. Part of those issues are actually are both historical and also driven by contemporary drivers of urban inequality. The second aspect that I think is worth emphasizing is that in addition to those who are landless and homeless, is that people who even do have access to homes are subjected to really the dominating narrative of property being a commodity and not being something that is somebody's home, a place where they have access to a whole lot of things, including central rights, being dignity, equality, and freedom. And so where there's a constant threat of eviction or of them losing their home either through judicial processes and increasingly extrajudicial means, this really has an effect on the ability for that family to have a dignified life, and has long-lasting intergenerational effects, including immediate trauma. So those who are landless and those who have insecure access to a home are really at the heart of this issue that we're talking about now, being evictions, which we know is something that preceded the COVID-19 moment. But the call really for people to stay at home signifies that the home is the first line of defense against the virus. And so an inability to have that access to a home really exacerbates various issues, including now this public health concern. So what has the government done so far, and what are the problems, or rather shortcomings, and how do we address those, is what I'm going to focus on for the remainder of my contribution to the session. So in the first week of lockdown, I think that we were all quite excited by the state's instatement of a broad moratorium on evictions during the lockdown period. This followed international best practice, again signifying the home as a line of defense and really ensuring, we had hoped, the ability for people to stay home in line with the various protective measures that had been put in place. However, in that very same week, we also saw the continued demolitions of homes, particularly in informal settlements, in Durban first, and then across the country, in Johannesburg, in Cape Town. We saw this in the Impolweni community. And so it really brought to the fore that, you know, while the rest of the country has been called to stay at home, the lives and really the small spaces that certain people have, being poor Black people, are being destroyed. And so at that point, poverty, in fact, has been criminalized and is not being centered with the broader objectives being a prohibition on evictions. And this challenge has become even greater for various reasons, including that after the initial phase of the lockdown, the legal protection or the broad prohibition against evictions was somewhat substantially limited with the Alert Level 3 and Alert Level 4 regulations, which provide that whereas in the first phase, there was a complete prohibition on the institution and hearing as well as the execution of evictions, that is now possible if the court deems it just and equitable to grant an eviction order. We have submitted to the presidency and the National Command Council, together with a host of social justice movements and organizations, that this presents some serious difficulties and really undermines the gist of the need to stay at home, particularly at a time where, as we are all aware, the numbers are increasing with the scourge of infections across the country. And so the ability to have a court-ordered eviction really, the possibility of that really undermines the ability to stay home. And we know, as AD has mentioned, who will be most affected, and that's been the poor and vulnerable, and those who without means of alternatives and also without means of having adequate support. There is no comprehensive study on the nature and extent of evictions, but we have some indicators to really show that this is something that has increased, the evictions and the threat of evictions is something that has increased exponentially over the past few months. Our law center, which is very small alone, has had over 200 requests for advice on this very issue, and there are hundreds of other advice officers and law firms and centers that are grappling with these issues. There are new organizations and formations coming up to address exactly these questions, formations that didn't exist prior to COVID-19. And so the issue is really, it's a really serious one, and I think we ought to address it with the measure of seriousness that's required, or else we, like other cities across the world, are really going to be grappling with, and I think for years to come, this impending crisis of evictions and homelessness, which happens where the safeguards that are in place are either insufficient or the enforcement mechanisms just aren't in place to deal with the issues. Now, the rationale that was given to lessen the protection for evictions was a concern that was that the particularly private landlords, small-scale private landlords, ought to also be able to earn an income that being derived from the rent that they would receive from rentals. This is a real, and I think we ought to grapple with this. It's linked to what I said earlier around the commodification of housing being prioritized over the right to a home. And so while that was a consideration, it's potentially dangerously imbalanced, where we are in a country where over 48% of the population is renting a home. And so we ought to also consider not only the financial impact that they may have, but really this tension of not being able, increasing income insecurity, coupled now with having to have a decision of, do you put bread on the table or do you pay your rent? These are the very real issues that we are receiving on a day-to-day basis when people are asking for advice about what to do next. So it really is a quagmire, but I think that there are some solutions about ways forward, solutions that we can learn from other states and other cities that are grappling with these issues worldwide, but also things that really bring us to the heart of, I think, what our constitution mandates and requires us to do. But before I go into that, I just want to articulate two specific issues that have manifested themselves over the period. While there is that limited now prohibition on evictions in place, there's a huge problem in terms of the enforceability of that mechanism. Regulation 48 of the current Alert Level 3 regulations criminalizes illegal evictions. Now, this is, of course, something that's supported by existing legislation, being the Prevention of Illegal Evictions Act, as well as Section 26 of the Constitution, which says that nobody may be evicted from their home without a court order. However, private landlords are circumventing all of these processes by either locking people out where they haven't been able to pay their rent, which is in part as a result of losing income over the past period, and are locking people out. They are causing evictions in the sense that they're disconnecting people's water or electricity, making it almost impossible to stay where they're staying. But the police are required, if this is something that's criminalized, to step in. And we haven't been seeing this with the police, I think, also being informed by the dominant ideology that the home is, property and ownership trump over the right to a home. And so these things are really the things that we are grappling with. What does a right mean if the enforcers don't believe or act on that right? The second huge and I think bigger concern is where demolitions of homes and evictions actually happen at the hands of the state actors who act without, who act with impunity. We've seen this in informal settlements across the country. Fortunately, some of these demolitions have been documented so that we know the extent of the violence, which is often hidden. But even without that documentation, what does it mean? That documentation through videos, photos, and otherwise. What does it mean to have a stay-home policy when some people's homes are completely undermined and not thought of as homes? So these raise some serious questions, which I think are legal in part, but also political. What is a home? What is a home to somebody who has whose access is a few zinc materials and a few assets that can be completely demolished and thereafter confiscated without any recourse? This is what's happening throughout the country in spite of this pandemic. And so while this is in place, while this is happening, there's a very troubling narrative that's also been put out that people are taking advantage of this lockdown period, and these are nothing but land invasions. This is something that's really difficult to accept in the context of what I spoke to earlier around the class of a class of people who are landless, which is historical and also contemporary, but also I think fails to ignore how it is that people have come to occupy land, the failures by the state, as Adi mentioned, to release parcels of land for housing, even where people can develop their own housing, as people have done. I'm not in any means advocating for mass occupation of land, but I think that any state actors who are acting in line with the Constitution and indeed with the lockdown regulations ought to consider what it is that they're demolishing. And at the heart of it, it's somebody's home. And so when they do so, there ought to be a certain criteria that is followed before a demolition occurs. Is this somebody's home? Who is living here? What options are available to them? How is it that they came to be on these parcels of land, as opposed to the abrupt, complete disregard that they have by lifting whole structures with women and children inside, as we've seen over the news, in the news over the past little while. So finally, some solutions perhaps. I agree with Adi that this moment has been really critical for civil society to come together in terms of making some demands, and it's been a useful space for us to build networks of solidarity, as well as formulate some very sharp and crisp responses that we can engage government on. And that's been very important because as like government, we're all in this together for the first time. While we're in it together, yes, we're in the same storm, but we're in different boats. And I think that it's for us who are representing and working with the most vulnerable to really use the moment to articulate what are the most critical issues. I think I'm running out of time, but going forward, I really think that if we are to come out of this with any sense of stability, the primary thing is to ensure that the burden that this pandemic has placed on all of society isn't carried fully or wholly by the most vulnerable. And that requires specific mechanisms to be instated by the state, including, for example, relief for landlords, as opposed to saying, well, now you can evict people so that you can have your return on your investment being prioritized over the home. And I think I'll end there, but this call to stay at home has really signified the importance of a home. This is where various struggles intersect, and it is where we really ought to be acting on. I agree fully with Eddie, accelerating the release of state-owned land to build affordable housing and simultaneously protecting the limited security of tenure that people do have to maintain what they call a home.
Thanks, Mandisa. That was very powerful and very provocative. Particularly, I really like this idea, what is a home? And how can we criminalize people who are actually building their homes by themselves and actually building this city up for what it is? So we're coming to question and answer after Charlton has spoken, and I will briefly introduce Charlton as well. So Charlton Zeervogel is the Managing Director of Community Organization Resource Center. CORC is a support NGO for the Federation of the Urban and Rural Poor, FEDUP, and the Informal Settlement Network, and is also affiliated with Slum Dwellers International that has a footprint in about 33 countries in the Global South. Charlton has previously worked in the SDI Secretariat as a program manager, and he has a master's degree in sociology. And since 2006, Charlton has had a specific focus on urban issues, skills development programs, various strategies for slum upgrading, data collection, and has been centrally involved in the Know Your City campaign run by Slum Dwellers International. Charlton, over to you.
Hi, thank you so much, Adi, for that introduction, and thanks again to DAG and the other partners for this opportunity to speak. I am going to be sharing some slides. So if you could just hold on 1 second. There we go. Okay, so I've been tasked to speak about this issue of de-densification and the issues of available land and housing typologies. And this particular phrase became quite a hot topic in the beginning parts of the lockdown. And it's something that actually in a way caused one of those moments in time where civil society organizations could again galvanize and unite around a particular issue. Just to speak a little bit about the de-densification issue, this was primarily aimed at informal settlements. So in the context that I'll be speaking about, the idea was, and this plan was coming from national government, was that you've got informal settlements, you've got problems of high density inside of these informal settlements, people living in close proximity to each other, and these conditions could really encourage the rapid increase and spread of the virus. On top of that, you have issues of water and sanitation access, and so this is obviously seen as a method to try and mitigate that response, mitigate those problems. Now, when we talk about the densities, I thought it appropriate just to start by speaking about a little bit of background about the densities that we're referring to here. So I thought I'd share a city like Cape Town, where I'm from. There's a population density of about, on average, 1,700 people per square kilometer, right? And a city like Johannesburg, 2,900 people per square kilometer, and Durban, 2,600. You contrast that with a city like New York, between 27,000 to 38,000 people per square kilometer. And then you look at one of the biggest informal settlement or slum areas in the world, Dharavi in India. There, the population density is about 354,000 people per square kilometer. So now I start thinking about, okay, so what does it look like in the South African context? Then yeah, I'd like to share a specific settlement. You can actually see a little bit of that settlement in the background. It's one called Kosovo, and that one has a density of about 45,586 people per square kilometer. So I put that picture up just so that you can get in your minds this idea of what that density looks like. So in the beginning, this was the idea that there's a response to this pandemic. We need to try and get some of these settlements de-densified, the idea to move some people out. And I thought within the context of this discussion, it's important to note, like I shared, that there were about 29 settlements identified for this. In the city where I live, there were 2 settlements identified, Kosovo being one and Danune being another. And the idea was to try and move out. In the Kosovo instance, I think it's about 1,500 to 2,000, and in the Danune instance, about 1,500 households as well out of the parent settlement. And I think I wanted to share these stats in the beginning because it's important to note that in South Africa we have over 3,000 informal settlements, and the concern that we realized as civil society organizations was that this focus on de-densifying what is effectively a very small percentage of settlements was not really a good strategy in terms of responding to the pandemic. And there are a couple of very other practical reasons for why we felt like this was a little bit of a challenge. And some of these concerns which we raised as civil society organizations was that in some cases, if it's not managed well, so you've got to have really good informed consent, then you could end up with a scenario where you've got forced removal. It's also quite a complex and contested process to carry out. So who gets selected to move? What happens when they finally get moved? What happens to the shacks that they get moved from? Relocation itself, and this is a version of relocation, is highly disruptive, right? So it's disruptive to people's livelihoods, to their social networks, and can actually result in more marginalized groupings forming. There are also some technical considerations. We saw that it's not really an emergency response. And I think the realities of this we can see because even though this was a very hot topic touted at the very beginning of the crisis, so as we went into lockdown in March, we haven't seen significant progress on any of these targeted areas. And that's because it does take a long time to actually do this in a good way. So there's issues of land identification. And as you know, the theme of this webinar, land is quite a critical issue in all the South African cities. So even just getting that land freed up becomes quickly also becomes a problem. We identified that there's also resource and capacity consideration. So I think one of the big concerns that we had at the beginning was with this focus on this particular process, there was also going to be a focus of finances into what would effectively be a small number of settlements. Now, this isn't to say that government wasn't trying to at the same time initiate a much broader response. But I think our concerns initially were that this being the headline response was not the best strategy. There's also issues of the limited human resource capacity. So we know that at national, provincial, and municipal level, we do have capacity issues. And during a time of crisis, there's actually a need to have all hands on deck to see to some of the more pressing priorities. There's also some risks and unintended consequences. We know from the history in many of our South African cities that when you go through a process of relocation, and in particular when you set up temporary relocation areas or temporary residential areas or whatever they're calling it these days, these are not as temporary as the name implies, and you end up with long-term arrangements that need to be managed by the city itself. There's also a difficulty in the government being able to control the growth once you move people out of the parent settlement and even onto the new site. One of the things that I think we also identified as civil society organizations at the start was that there was also a lot of international guidance around this. And like Mandisa mentioned, issues of evictions, just issues of generally moving large numbers of people around during a time of a pandemic was considered not best practice. And so we were trying to really push for different approaches and different strategies. So when it came to this particular crisis, and when we're talking about over 3,000 informal settlements, pandemic hitting the country, cases starting to slowly increase, as civil society organizations, we said, okay, yes, there could be a longer term need to de-densify settlements. And if you think back to the densities that I described, when you look at Kosovo's density in relation to the rest of the city, the obvious conclusion is surely there needs to be some decanting that needs to happen. But this cannot be something that happens in an emergency situation. So we thought, okay, short-term responses, you've got to focus on the things that are critical. Identify all settlements across the country, assess their needs, prioritize those settlements based on the type. So obviously water supply, sanitation is some of the top things that needed to be addressed. We live in a country where, yes, you have houses, formal houses where people have access to one toilet and often more. They have access to multiple taps, but you also have scenarios on the flip side in informal settlements where as many as 150 households share one tap, or 150 households share one toilet. These are the numbers that we're speaking about when we talk about Kosovo informal settlement. So the thinking was definitely we need to focus and prioritize some of these shorter term issues, and water and sanitation was on the top of the list. There was also this need to say, okay, we need to identify and mobilize our partners. We also have to focus on a decentralized approach, because at the end of the day, like Adi mentioned, like Mandisa mentioned, the metros is where the game is at, and where you've really got to have the power to be able to deliver the required basic services at a scale that would help manage the pandemic. Remember, this is in a situation where we're telling people to stay at home, wash your hands regularly, and yet you have informal settlement dwellers who don't have access to water and who don't have access to their own toilet and have to share. And in the beginning of the crisis, we had to think about what does it mean to actually try and remain home inside of an informal settlement while still having to venture out and use all these communal facilities where you have these high ratios of sharing. Another big focus that we said was communications around behavior change, education and information. And then since the start of the crisis, a big focus on food, food response. So that was sort of the short-term approach. And as you can see in there, when it comes to informal settlements, that the focus was really around trying to tackle something which has been an ongoing issue for many years in the country, and that is the lack of access to basic services. And so, yes, there was a strong push to say, identify as many of the settlements that have no access to these services. These ones need to be sorted out immediately. And then those that had limited access needed to get increased access. And there was a certain level of response from government. We would have seen the water tanks as being one of the big issues that was rolled out across the country. And then also the attempt to try and increase services inside settlements. But setting all of that up for the short term, and we described the short term in the beginning as a 0 to 3 month period. So technically speaking, we're actually moving out of the short term. And so you have to ask yourself, okay, so what is the medium term responses when we're speaking about informality, and what are the appropriate ways that we can try and address the issues? And looking at the context that we're in today in South Africa, one of the things that we identified as civil society organizations was that there is a need to implement and accelerate in situ upgrading. And the upgrading of informal settlements program, which is something that government has had around since 2004, I believe. There's also the need to look at integrating and optimizing incremental services provision. So the idea here is to try and set systems in place that speaks to a longer term agenda of aiming for that one-to-one service potential. An example of this is reblocking as a methodology. Some of you might have heard about this, but this is about reconfiguring a settlement so that you can bring in more services. In the picture that you see on the screen right now, this is a good example of what settlements look like inside of urban spaces. This one in particular comes from the Guguletu area in Cape Town, and often the case is that it's not a case of not having enough space for the service. It's a case of the organizing of the space that's not well enough to be able to bring services inside. So you'll see in this picture that you'll actually find the services often sitting at the edge of the settlement, and then people inside the settlement have to walk to get to their ablution block or their toilets or that one communal tap. We also thought that it's appropriate to look at regulatory flexibility. So one of the big issues that we find is that a lot of the regulations set up currently don't speak to informality, even though inside of the metros, you find that the informal settlements are actually forming the major contributor to housing for the urban poor. And yet the regulations, the policies in place, some of them totally do not match up to the kinds of densities that we find in informal settlements, and it doesn't match up in terms of what is required for affordability, for space, and those kinds of factors. We also identify that within this medium term, it's also good to look at alternative dense housing typologies to try and figure out how can we house people at levels that are required when we sit with the scarcity of land. And I think this links back perfectly to the topic and the way I'd introduced it in the beginning. There is a situation in a city like Cape Town, for example, where well-located land just does not get released. And so you heard Adi speak about that figure. 1/5 of the backlog could be tackled if we see the release of these 3 significant pieces of land. And I think the important thing to note when we're speaking about informal settlements and their upgrading is that in a lot of cases, the upgrade does require you to look a little bit at what happens to the people that need to be moved off the site. But even in doing upgrading within informal settlements, you still sit with a scenario where you might perpetuate the spatial inequality that exists in South African cities. In some instances, you find informal settlements that are well located, that could be put on a path of in situ incremental upgrading, that are close to transport nodes, close to employment opportunities. And if anything, as cities in South Africa, we need to look more at how we maximize those opportunities and create viable spaces for people to build their homes and make their homes. So there is a lot of different kinds of models that we can look at when we're trying to address the issue of informality. I think in the scenario that I've described with the short-term focus caused by the pandemic, there's definitely that focus on service delivery, which has been inadequate across many informal settlements. But as we enter the medium and now to longer term, it's really about trying to unlock the potential to initiate upgrading of informal settlements at a scale that we haven't had before. Tied to this in the longer term is really looking at regulatory reform and alignment across the fiscal instruments and policy frameworks. A big issue in this regard is there is government, you know, in South Africa has had a long history of focus on BNG housing and the financing of that top structure, but there is no mechanism for trying to find ways to finance the incremental build or to assist people in doing this type of build where in actual fact you are creating your own home. And what's happening is that hundreds of thousands of residents of South Africa living inside of informal settlements are actually housing themselves, and they're paying for that housing themselves, and there's no support mechanism to improve those top structures. We also in these appropriate responses, it's also a good idea to look at strengthening urban management and area-based management, and this links back again to the topics that Mandisa and Adi covered. It's essential to consider the holistic approach, to look at this integrated development approach, where the edges of the city are not the only places where we find spaces for the urban poor. So, leveraging the COVID-19 response. We can all agree that the situation we're in is unprecedented. It's brought, like Adi and Mandisa shared, a strong focus on the inequality that exists in many of our South African cities today, and it's highlighted this gap that we've had, and it's shown us that there is actually no way that we can have this as business as usual once we move through the crisis. So yes, we might be living with this virus for a while, for quite a while longer, and we all talking about the new normal. And one of the big pushes that we'll have to think about as we head into the medium to longer term with this virus and with the housing situation in South Africa is to think about how we make sure we don't default back to what business was like before. A big part of this is to say basic services. How do we get that at the levels that allow us to future-proof against scenarios like COVID-19, and to maintain hygiene levels across an entire city, not just parts of it. We also need to use this opportunity to accelerate reforms around building regulations suited to scalable, higher density, self-building urban areas. I think what we also can do is accelerate the opportunity for in situ incremental upgrading projects. What we've seen in the past and linked to this is this idea of really building the capacity to do this incremental approach, is that local municipalities were very happy with packaging informal settlement upgrading projects as such, but they were actually greenfield projects where you would move a large amount of people, clear an informal settlement site, and build your housing project. And this would be termed an informal settlement upgrade. And so we haven't really initiated the machinery of the upgrading of informal settlements program or taken advantage of the National Upgrading Support Program. And we find ourselves stuck today in timelines that cause the upgrading of settlements to have time horizons of 10 to 15 years. And in our experience, what we've learned is that you end up asking people to wait for housing on a housing waiting list. And now you find people waiting for upgrading on an upgrading projects waiting list. So the opportunity, the call to action now is to ensure that we don't sit with this very long time periods to actually move informal settlement projects along. There are many projects that have had a lot of work done on them over the course of the last 5 to 10 years. But this crisis, and that's one of the issues that I didn't touch on at the beginning when I said why were we concerned about this approach. It also ran the risk of diverting a lot of resources away from projects which had actually been progressed quite significantly, pushing for this almost like knee-jerk fast response. And the idea is to rather accelerate the projects that have already had considerable work done, where there's been good participatory processes unfolding, and ensure that you continue to support those projects as part of a longer term plan. So, where to next? I think it's important to note that in South Africa, we sit with a scenario where we have the upgrading of informal settlements program started in 2004, NASP established in 2009, and the principles inside of the program and the support process is good. South Africa is known for always developing these good guiding documents, the good policies, but it's the implementation of those at the scale that is required that hasn't worked as well. There's the lack of capacity at the municipal level, but also sitting inside of communities is an opportunity to develop this capacity to effectively implement in situ informal settlement upgrading at a scale that's required if we look at the over 3,000 informal settlements across the country. So we need to look at where do we require policy shifts that prioritize releasing of well-located land, and this was exactly the first topic that Adrian Mandisa began to speak to. We need to look at the opportunities that are created for self-build. Really, there isn't a long-term sustainable model which has the fiscus of our government funding housing into infinity. We know that this model is not sustainable long-term. So how do we enhance people's ability to self-build? We also need to look at how we push this incrementalism approach that opens up the funding mechanisms to complement people's own resources with government funding. Like we described, there isn't a mechanism that helps unlock the potential for hundreds of thousands of people to participate in their own home building and homemaking. And then we need to look at those development of the typologies that steps outside of the BNG and tackles issue of density required in urban spaces. I think what the topic itself, when it says de-densification of informal settlements, the reality is that in general in our cities there is a need to densify, to try and get the numbers correct, because once you get certain densities, your cities start making sense in terms of efficiency for service provision and transportation and all of that. So it's really about trying to understand how can we unleash models that allow for these densities. I want to speak about two things in closing, two examples really. So the one I mentioned, the Kosovo informal settlement, which is one of those settlements listed for de-densification. And land that's been identified for that particular settlement close by is a portion of land which the Federation of the Urban Poor social movement, which we support, owns. And now we sit with a scenario where there's an opportunity to accelerate the development of that parcel of land. But what's interesting is that this federation group, this group of predominantly women, have been inside of that housing project for 25 years. And when they started out on this mission, they imagined houses that were freestanding on large plots with for the 40 square meter minimum footprint. And because of the situation we're in today, we've had to get to a point where those very same women had to imagine something different. Smaller plots, double-story houses, shared walls, all these kinds of things. And we're at a position now where we can speak about a different kind of density. Then there's a settlement, an informal settlement. So this one is really looking at the crux of what it takes. And I wanted to end by showing this picture. This is an example of an informal settlement in Cape Town called Umshiniwa, which went through a reblocking process, where they went from 250 shacks sharing 2 taps and about 12 chemical toilets. Today they have about 190 taps and a similar amount of toilets and electrified. And they went through the process of saying, okay, how do we improve our situation? And they started building double story. And the end result, what we did with by supporting them, was looking at how we can actually assist them to build in situ double story solutions that have a longer term, more permanent and incremental approach. This particular structure is something that can be formalized over a period of time, step by step and by the person themselves. So the space that we find ourselves in now currently is quite a challenging one, and it calls for very innovative solutions. There are a number of other civil society organizations that are exploring different typologies. All of them speak to density, self-build, the opportunity to do in situ construction. But at the same time, you will need to also free up well-located land so that the overflow, additional people, not everyone might be able to be housed in that settlement, can find an opportunity to build their home also in a well-located, well-established space. Thank you.
Thanks, Charlton. Excellent and very provocative as well. I'd ask Charlton, yourself and Mandisa to just keep your videos on. And the advantage of being a moderator on this particular session is I can field all the difficult questions to the two of you who are my now guinea pigs. So maybe just picking up on something that you were saying, Charlton, right towards the end. So two questions, and I'll let you mull over it, and I'll pose two questions to Mandisa as well while you think about it. So the first question is that as you're speaking about this de-densification, so maybe just comment a little bit about what happens if people that need to be relocated do not agree to be relocated, or do not consider them appropriate, or do not consider it appropriate to relocate to any of these TRAs. What happens in those particular instances, and is that then again require a court order, as Mandisa was explaining, for moving them? And then the second question, I think, I mean, as the resources diminish, and you spoke about this, that we can't build housing in perpetuity. We're also hearing a big move towards the implementation of service sites across not just Western Cape, but across the country, like where municipalities are moving away from top structure and moving to service sites. And what's the view with regards to service sites? Is it something that's actually a managed land settlement that allows to deal with issues of urbanization? Can it be done proactively? What are the Alliance's views around dealing with service sites and not a provision of top structure generally? And what does that mean for the right to housing? Mandisa, I've definitely got easier questions for you. In terms of just so one of the questions that the audience is asking for is there kind of a clarity in legislation around the home and housing? Is there a definitional clarity that allows us in the law to differentiate what counts as a home and as a consequence? And I remember reading it in one of the court papers, but perhaps some clarity what would define as a home. And then the second piece, that's a very interesting concept or idea from somebody's post around gender-based violence, that how does the right to housing, and because of congested conditions, both not just in informal settlements and backyards, but also in social housing projects in some instances, the high degree of gender-based violence that we're seeing, how do we balance the right to housing with the right to safety and protection? And does that really, in some ways, the right to housing leading to compromising the right to safety and protection if it's not done appropriately and within the parameters of the law? Charlton, do you want to go first?
Hi, Adi. Yeah, so you're fading out a little bit. So your second question, you're just gonna have to give that to me. I caught the first one, which was the issue of people not wanting to be relocated. What happens in that instance? And I think particularly within this de-densification issue, the story that we've been told, and I think that's also the other issue, we haven't been given enough detail about the process of how this would unfold. But we've been ensured by government that this process is meant to be totally voluntary, that there will be no forcing of people to relocate. But again, it's like what happens if your target is 1,500 people and only 500 people are willing to move? And I think that's the problem. That's the issue here. It's fine to say that this will all be voluntary based, but what happens? Heaven forbid you build your 1,500 units and you only have 500 people that are willing to move. I think what makes that question a little bit more complicated, and so I can't give you the best answer here, but I can add to some of the complications is people are concerned about what happens when I move. How long will I be there for? This is a temporary relocation area, whether it be transitional housing. What happens to my structure that I've vacated in my settlement? Once that structure gets taken down, which is what government has also spoken about, what happens to that space? So there's this issue that makes it really much more complicated. So I think the answer we've been given is it's totally voluntary. The issue that we have is how much level of participation is there in identifying the people that want to move. And then I think it comes down to this when the rubber hits the road. Is it really going to be voluntary? Because you could then end up with having to urge some people along, and that's the situation we need to avoid. Your second question, Adi, you were cutting out quite badly, so I didn't pick it up.
I just wanted to ask Charlton, consistently many of the metro municipalities have underspent on their USDG funding that is intended to deal with issues of basic services and upgrading and so on. And as the resources are diminishing, we're hearing noises from various government quarters that top structure isn't going to be as much of a priority like you were mentioning, and that the move is going to be much more towards service side. And do you have a clear sense from the organizations that you support and you work with, especially community-based, what the sense is like if state moves away from top structure, then what is prioritized and what is appropriate? And is it really the top structure? Is it really the service side that we should be advocating for?
You really don't want to give me easy questions today. I think in terms of our experience, right, our social movements have always told us for the longest time that the biggest thing that they've always have to face with convincing or getting communities to think differently is this issue of how much does get promised at the one end. So I think that's the uphill battle that's been fought, right? This idea that there was this promise made for the house. So the longer term goal is to say, okay, there's the house, there's waiting for the house, but what happens in the meantime? Just within the informal settlement space and upgrading space, the idea was to say, let's try and improve your situation where you are, right? And linked to that, and you'll see the point that I'm making here, the link to that is also to try and encourage communities to bring online whatever of their own resources they can, because it's become clear that the waiting list, that the housing delivery model is not going to see to everyone's needs. So this brings us to the issue of the service sites. And I can share that in the current scenario, we've had discussions with our informal settlement network and the Federation of the Urban Poor. And in some cases, even when it comes to this issue of services inside of the settlements and not having enough space, people are saying, okay, give us that additional land and we can do the construction on that land ourselves. So I don't want to say that there's a blanket statement around we're okay with the service sites. I think linked to that issue is the location of these sites. That's probably one of the biggest things. You could do a lot of service sites that are set up quite well for people to do their self-build, but at the end of the day, they could be located in areas which are really not going to be supportive of what we call community building and this human settlements holistic approach. So yeah, I think again, a complicated topic to tackle, but definitely there's this opportunity to self-build is something that we need to build on. We've seen that when in instances where tenure is guaranteed or secured, even if it's not secured with a paper, but with an investment, people are willing to invest their own resources to build that home, to upgrade a structure, to cement their foundation, to start tiling the inside of their structure. So these all become possibilities when that issue of land is resolved. And I think that's the underlying thing that needs to be linked to the service sites. Is it a service site without tenure? What is the long-term arrangement of that thing? Because that in part will answer the question of how people take to those sites. Thanks.
Thanks, Charlton. Mandisa? Mandisa?
Hi again. So the first question around legislation and the home. So the housing and the home have almost been used interchangeably in current legislation. So for example, if we're to start with the Constitution, Section 26 of the Constitution provides that everybody has a right to adequate housing. The further section goes on to say that nobody may be arbitrarily deprived of their home. And so we can see there that there is an explicit intention to acknowledge and recognize people having access to a house for residential purposes. there's a slew of legislation that gives meaning to this right to access to housing, as well as to protect people's access to a home, including the Prevention of Illegal Evictions Act, which I referred to. I think that the challenge is beyond looking at definitions in legislation, as well as including court cases that have actually been before the court on asking what does a home mean. I think that what we're seeing on the ground is an inability to really accept and center that some people's structures, as has been referred to in this conversation, actually constitute somebody's home. And those people who are occupying structures, which is a language that I think we ought to begin to move away from, are the same people whose homes are being demolished in the names of this just being a structure. And the reason that I want to emphasize moving away from that is that it's linked to who is and who isn't able to claim a sense of belonging in a city. And so this is informed, of course, by our past, where there was limitation on movement, on access to the city, with past laws around migrant labor, etc., etc. But even now, still today, we're seeing some people being treated as temporary because of their structures, which don't constitute their homes. That is how, in practice, enforcement agencies, for example, your anti-land invasion units, or even private securities, can come and demolish a structure because there's not that centering of the home as a place. So if we're to go to legislation, primary legislation being the Constitution, yes, certainly the home is articulated. But more than that, I think it's a need for a shared understanding politically and also in society, where, for example, we see NIMBYs calling on people to be displaced. These are private parties saying that this is not somebody who has an entitlement to have a space of residence, their home, in such in any specific place. I don't know if everybody has access to the questions and answers, but there's a really useful answer that's been provided by somebody who almost poetically has defined what a home means to an individual person. So yes, those are the issues that we ought to be centering, I think, including in our activism. The next question I didn't really get.
Sorry, Mandisa, I'll reframe the question as well. So one of the questions that a few people have flagged on the chat is that, with what Ndufuno Kwazi has been doing through the Law Center around the evictions and the moratorium on evictions, and also the work around the release of well-located land, is this a new dispossession for land ownership in South Africa? Are we looking at a very radically different future if both the expropriation bill is enacted as well as other pieces of legislation really come to fruition in the way it's imagined? Is it a really different dispensation that we're looking forward to?
I'm sorry, Eddie, just to clarify, you mean if this legislation is implemented?
That's correct.
Okay. So I think, Eddie, in your presenting and opening remarks, you referred to a few years ago where 2018 rather, where the question of land being at the center of a lot of issues that we are facing in terms of deepening inequality was centered politically around the question of expropriation, around compensation. But really what that forced us into thinking about was, if we accelerate the release of state land for the purposes of affordable housing, spatial restructuring, and the advancement of various socioeconomic rights, we might then begin to see a different future. This is something that's been very slow, the release of state land, as you've articulated, the slow pace of housing delivery for the purposes of advancing people's access to homes, especially in places where they've been previously excluded, why the principle of spatial justice, as per Splumer, becomes very critical. The activation of all of these pieces of legislation, together with, I would advocate for new legislation to give effect to, for example, Section 25(5) of the Constitution, which provides that the state must make land available on an equitable basis. There's that obligation without the necessary legislation to give effect to it, to say how, when, and the steps that ought to be taken so that people can really command and call on that right to have access to land on an equitable basis. So without these being activated, and we can understand why, we can understand that there's definitely an interest for some in maintaining the status quo, being continued holding of land for a small a grouping of people, coupled with even the state holding land for speculative purposes, where land is sold for short-term capital injection to supplement budget and other issues. And so for as long as that's the case, the release of land and building of affordable housing and other socioeconomic objectives really does fall behind, and the inequality that we see in our spatial formation is entrenched, and in fact the spatial apartheid that we are advocating ought to be disrupted is reproduced. And so I don't think that there's a single shot silver bullet to the solution. It really requires a holistic a holistic response to a complex and long-standing issue that's really entrenched what South Africa looks like, and I think we ought to call on something different.
Excellent, Mandisa. Thank you. Thanks, Mandisa. Thanks, Charlton. I'm going to have to move on because we're getting a little bit pressed for time. We're going to come back to you, Mandisa and Charlton, once Pumeza and Mike have spoken. So I'm going to introduce Pumeza now, who's going to talk us through the delivery of basic services through the Asivikelani campaign. Pumeza is very well known South African activist. She's a senior program officer with International Budget Partnership South Africa. She's also the co-author of the book Fragments of Activism and a fellow of the Social Change Initiative and the former General Secretary of Social Justice Coalition for many years. Pumeza, over to you.
Thank you, Adi, and thank you for inviting me. So I think my conversation and my contribution to the conversation has sort of been assisted by Mandisa and Charlton. And I think if we're about to talk about service delivery in informal settlements, that conversation is not isolated to questions of land, to questions of different types of densification, upgrading, and public participation. And so I think while I'm going to talk about specifically basic services, we must see it within the lens of all the issues that informal settlements already have to deal with. So I thought a good way to start the conversation is to say, what is Asivikelani, which I've been asked to speak briefly about. And Asivikelani started about 3 months ago, as soon as the president announced that there will be a national lockdown and that there is a state of disaster in the country. And it is a collaborative project with about 9 organizations, and 3 of those organizations are actually speaking in this panel today. And basically what Asivikelani does really looks at what are the issues residents in informal settlements are dealing with, especially under the national lockdown. And we're looking at basic things like access to water, access to sanitation, access to refuse collection, public lighting, soap, and etc. And the footprint, as I mentioned, has about 9 organizations, and all these different organizations are spread across 6 metropolitan municipalities and in 7 local municipalities in the country. And obviously there's a moving number of residents that we are engaging, but in the last conversation, we engaged about 580 residents, which are spread over 201 informal settlements in the country. And so a lot of conversations are about, yes, we have issues in informal settlements, but how does Asivikelani really looks at them differently? And I think for us, this is a new way of trying to say, in as much as we can't go to our communities, because we know a lot of our movements and our organizations really interact with communities directly, but we still need to ensure that the voices of residents are really amplified. And so what we've started using is using different mobile platforms, which are using your WhatsApp, your SMSs, your multimedia, photos, videos, to really try and see what are the issues that informal settlements are raising or are experiencing under the lockdown. And this is a cycle that is on a bi-weekly basis, where informal settlements residents really respond to very basic questions. And with that information, we do three main things. One is to publicly release what the issues are, really clean it up and summarize that an area in an informal settlement in Buffalo City municipality, these are the issues that they're facing with water, or in Cape Town or in Ekurhuleni. Really simply reflect the voices of the residents without analyzing it. And the second thing we do with the information is to really try and engage with the different municipalities to say, look, these are the issues that your informal settlements are facing right now. And our push is on municipalities to really speed up service delivery and the urgency of service delivery, and which we know has always been a problem. And so if we aren't amplifying that, it means the risk that we are all scared of contracting the coronavirus is much more greater for people living in informal settlements. And then the last leg of what we use the information for, beyond engaging government and for awareness, is to really use some of this information for developing other advocacy material, but also starting to think about budget reasons. Why are we where we are today? Why are we having these problems? Why, even during a national lockdown, we still have informal settlements that don't have basic services. And I think what Civic Land has been picking up is that there's still informal settlements in Cape Town or in Johannesburg and eThekwini that still don't have any sanitation at all. And I think the conversation that we were having in the last panel is that, yes, there's reasons for that, but how do we move forward with that? And we're trying to see how municipalities really use the crisis to be creative in terms of how they deal with informal settlements at large. The second thing that Asivikelani has really, just from the lessons, because obviously there's been different cycles that we've been able to do with the campaign. Right now, today, we're finalizing the latest release, which will be week 8 of the cycles. But over the few weeks, the few things that we've picked up is that, yes, a lot of our municipalities have really increase in terms of how they deliver water, additional water tanks, taps have been, permanent infrastructure has been put in some communities. But at the same time, even though there's that huge push of provision of water, we still see that there's still a lot of problems with water connection and water pressure issues. And so on the one hand, you have settlements that don't have water at all. But on the other hand, you have emergency provisions that aren't really addressing the issue, because when people want water, a lot of the times there's no water in the taps or the tanks. That also brings to the third point that, and I think the questions that speak bigger to the long term is, all of us do not want temporary solutions for basic sanitation. We want permanent solutions. And obviously, municipalities are stuck with the fact that there are some communities that don't have services at the moment. But we don't see a lot of creativity in terms of how do we use the current crisis to really speed up service delivery, but to also be creative so that we don't find ourselves where we are today. Had we dealt with informal settlements 20 years ago, probably the risk of people in all the informal settlements across the country would have been lessened. But this is where we are. How do we use that in a very strategic conversations? And we don't see municipalities really engaging in that conversation. And this is what we would like to push for. The fourth thing that, again, Asivikelani has been picking up in all the conversations with different municipalities, really trying to analyze where other blockages are. We know that there's no shortage of money right now. Our municipalities aren't short of financial resources. Municipalities have received additional resources from national government. I mean, we've all heard about the reallocation of USDG grants to municipalities. Just a few days ago, we heard about the 11 billion rands that municipalities are going to get that the minister announced. And so our view is that this is not a conversation of money. This is not a conversation of we don't have money to deliver services, but it's we need to use it as an opportunity to really push and ensure that the challenges that informal settlements face today are not exacerbated by how informal settlements were treated in the past. Another thing that we really picking up is something that a lot of the organizations that are part of Asivikelani have been saying for years, that there seems to be a different understanding within municipalities of what does communal cleaning or maintenance or cleaning of communal toilets means. And so we've been monitoring over the as I mentioned, over the past 8 cycles, that our toilets, and when I say toilets, I say communal toilets in informal settlements, there isn't routine cleaning. We see municipalities like Cape Town that have started in the recent weeks to really clean communal toilets on a daily basis. But there is this sort of clumping together what cleaning means. And so for a lot of the municipalities, cleaning means they come with a truck, they come and dislodge the chemical toilets, all the VIP toilets, and surface cleaning is not a language that our municipalities are talking about. And that is sort of across many of the informal settlements. And so in an emergency situation where everyone is on lockdown in an informal settlement, where they are sharing limited number of sanitation infrastructure, and at the same time the contact and the surface cleaning of those facilities isn't as robust as we would like to see it. And I think all the aspects I've been saying that we sort of need to, while washing our hands, we need to really guard our surroundings at all. But we don't feel like informal settlements are really taken care of from that angle. And again, maintenance and fixing of existing problems is still a huge issue, which a lot of the municipalities are struggling with. And the last thing before I conclude is that it seems even after this crisis, whereas we have billions of money that have been additionally put on it, the monitoring of how service delivery looks on the ground is still a major challenge. We don't see a robust way of saying, yes, we have paid for these amounts of taps, we have paid for these amount of water tanks or these amounts of bulk sanitizers, to check if these services actually reach the communities they intended. We still see sort of like a breakdown in what the municipalities are saying they've done and what the residents' experiences are on the ground. And we would think this would be an opportunity to really improve that linkage. And then I think in conclusion, and I think what Asivikelani for a lot of us and a lot of the residents that are part of is really guarding and not ignoring the voices of informal settlements residents, especially under a crisis. So a lot of the conversations are about yes, what needs to be done, how do we protect ourselves, but we also need to really listen and keep our ear on the ground is how do we protect informal settlements which are at a different context as compared to any other ordinary resident of the country. And so it's about amplifying those voices and really saying, let us really ensure that if a community in eThekwini or in East London is saying we don't have enough toilets, the conversation should be how do we deliver those toilets, and not be about whether you are not so well located land or not. And so these are some of the conversations we hope to really expand on. And two is really just saying, let us build the communication and engagement between government and communities. And I think with all the releases of Asivikelani is really trying to amplify that, to say, these are the results, these are where the issues are, this is what the residents are saying, can you fix the problems? And if we're gonna evaluate our impact, And if we're going to look back at history and how we treated our informal settlements in the future, we need to be able to go back and say we're able to identify where the issues are and we're able to resolve them. And then lastly, as just saying, this is a very well opportunity for municipalities to engage and really start being creative in terms of how do we rethink basic service delivery? How do we rethink how where money is put and how money is put for informal settlements? And also because every informal settlement residents now and all the organizations that are part of Asibekilani, they don't want communal toilets because they don't want informal settlements. And so how do we use, so our conversation has been using the campaign as a groundwork for a long-term conversation of how we deal with basic service delivery, but also how we rethink informal settlements. And so I thought I'll put those points for now, and then I'll rely on some of the questions for engaging a bit further.
Thanks, Pumeza. As always, excellent. I'm going to go over to Mike now and then come back to the Q&A side. Just to introduce Mike. So Mike is a development practitioner who's worked on the human settlement sector for over 25 years, from informal settlements to dealing with kind of constitutional rights around housing, basic services, social amenities. He's always pursued inclusive developments throughout his career. Mike completed his postgraduate diploma in land management and informal settlement upgrading with the Institute of Housing Studies at the Erasmus Universities in Rotterdam, and also completed a Masters of Science degree in built environment in the field of housing at the University of Wits. He's a professional trainer and community facilitator and has been working in the sector for 25 years. And for many of those years, he's been with Plan Act. Right, Mike?
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation, and much appreciated. Well, I'm going to speak about, and I'm going to rely on you to move the slides for me.
That's fine.
Let's go to the next slide. Plan Act was established in 1985, and its key mission is to amplify community voices, basically civic empowerment, making sure that the voices of poor and the vulnerable communities is heard loud and clear. Let's go to the next slide. Adi, let's go to the next slide. Okay, just a bit of context is that South Africa has a very good progressive policy and legal framework. However, like most of the speakers, is that there's very poor implementation on the progressive policies and the legal framework. So it's all about compliance. You know, people feel that government feel that they have complied. People have come and signed a register. They can prove that people have participated. So the issue of compliance is a very big issue. But the second thing that is also worrisome is that there seems to be a tendency of selective listening by government. What is it that I mean by that is that those who've got the resources, those who can speak loud, those who are closer to the center are the ones that have been listened to. And so it's worrisome that you have this kind of a challenge. Adi, let's go to the next slide. Can you hear me? Adi?
Yes, I can hear you, Mike.
You can hear me, all right.
Mike, your mic is mute.
Sorry. All right, I'm back. Let's go to the next slide, Adi. So the difficulty with the context of South Africa is that most communities, and when I refer to communities in this context, I'm referring to communities that live in the periphery of society, people that are found in informal settlement, those are vulnerable, that are poor. It's very difficult to understand the relationship between the IDP or integrated development and the budget process. Who really reads monthly reports of government, of municipality? Who reads annual reports and mid-year performance reports of municipalities? I am just imagining if I live in an informal settlement, this is not a priority for me. And I hardly even know where to find these monthly reports and these annual reports. So it's a big issue. There's a gap between the state and its citizen. Notwithstanding the fact that the Auditor General's reports on the state of local government finances, it's not very satisfactory. So there's a big, big problem that the country is facing. Next slide, please. Well, next slide, Adi. I would like to ask the question whether public participation is a myth or a reality. And that is my theme today, whether public participation is a myth or a reality. And I want to draw a couple of assumptions that is it true that public participation is a fundamental human right for all? Is it true? In the context of power relations, in the context of unequal partnerships, and we also know that that slide before, Adi, we also know that public participation can become an arena of exclusion. It can also become an arena of inclusion, but it's also an arena of confrontation. But it's also about consensus building. It's also about compromises. So once more, I ask the question whether public participation is a myth or a reality in the context of what I've just raised now. Let's go to the next slide. Thank you. Just keep them there. Well, I asked the question whether public participation does translate into accountability. I asked that pertinent question because it's very critical that whether participation does translate into accountability. I also asked the question, what is the incentive for participation? Does it even matter? Does participation really matter? Is it a myth or a reality? I also argue that if participation is a reality, to what extent can communities influence the budget of a municipality? If most of the greater part of the budget of the municipality is conditional grant, can communities influence the budget? I asked the question. And I asked that question because if communities are supposed to participate in the budget process, is it a myth or a reality? To what extent can they influence the budget? I will also want to refer to Chapter 6 of the Municipal Systems Act, which speaks about performance management. And that chapter is very critical for me, and I guess to the participants in this webinar. Because that section talks about, let me quote. The chapter says, communities must participate, and I underline, in the setting of appropriate key performance indicators and performance targets for the municipality. And I asked the question, is it possible? How can it be done? How can communities participate in setting appropriate key performance indicators and performance target for municipalities. Has it been done? Can it be done? Is it a myth? Is it a reality? Is it doable? Is it possible? I asked that question. Let's go to the next slide. So it is also important when we speak about public participation, then we also speak about community protocols. There are protocols in communities. You don't just go in and introduce yourselves. I'm Mike Makwela from Planet. No, there are protocols in communities beyond the ward committee, ward councillors and ward committees. There are gatekeepers. There are people that are very powerful in communities. They're movers and shakers. Okay. So if you do not understand community protocols, it will be difficult to engage with public participation. I also want to raise the issue that is important when we engage with the process of participation, that all relevant perspectives are taken into considerations. Let's remember, there are individuals that live in informal settlements and communities. Those individuals have got aspirations, have got fears, have got needs. And so they come into this space of engagement with different expectations. So it is important to consider those relevant perspectives, but also use multiple forms of knowledge. There are very good people in communities that can narrate the story of their community. Okay. But I am under no illusion, and I'm not going to glorify participation, because there are community dynamics in every community. Okay. So it's very important that we don't fall into the trap of over glorifying participation. It has its own challenges and dynamics. Okay, so I raised that point because it's very critical. Adi, let's go to the next slide. What then, in this new context of COVID-19, this new reality? Well, what we have seen is that in the recent IDP and the budget process, gone are the days of mass meetings where people will go to community halls, 200, 300 of us, and engage with the process of IDP or the budget. Gone are those days. You know, COVID has changed everything. And so the issue of visual engagement has become a reality that we have to live with. Okay. But in the context of that, even before the COVID-19, most municipalities actually indicated that they do not have adequate budget for participation related activities. It's quite interesting that when one looks at the budget of municipalities, almost 90% of them, not very much money is allocated for public participation. Just a little percentage is allocated for participation. And so there is an implication for participation, especially in the period of COVID pandemic. Okay, if municipalities don't have adequate budgets for participation when there is no COVID-19, how much more when the budget is shifted around to focus on basic services? So it means public participation will be relegated, and that's very, very worrisome. Let's go to the next slide. So what does it mean? It means government, in particular local government, will have to make sure that in future, even now, they have to provide both technical and financial support to communities for them to be able to participate in the virtual space. That's a new way of doing things now. That's a new reality. This is a new reality, that communities, for them to participate in governance processes, you know, the municipality will have to provide adequate budget for communities to engage. Let's go to the next slide. Let's go to the next slide, Adi. So what then means is that government has to invest in public participation. When local government in particular prioritizes its budget, the issue of public participation can no longer be relegated as a by the way. Okay. So government will have to explore other alternatives, community radios, social media. We must make sure that the websites of municipalities are functioning so that there is an interactive process that is happening. Because when you look at most of the websites of municipalities, they're actually outdated, not functioning. Okay. Let's go to the next slide. Let's go to the next slide, Adi. So the new reality is that the issue of innovation is very important, and municipalities and government is not exempted to this innovation. Gone are the days of mass meetings. All right, gone are the days of mass meetings. So it means municipalities will have to invest in innovation to be able to continue to engage with the citizen. Let's get to the last slide. Well, communities have to continue to do monitoring. The issue of monitoring is a very critical issue. When PlanAct does its work, the issue of monitoring keeps on coming back. Most municipalities do not have the necessary capacity to monitor the services. So communities will have to be included in the monitoring process, whether you are speaking about asivigelane, whether you are speaking about social audits, whether you're speaking about participatory budgeting. The issue of monitoring is very, very critical and very key. And so this new reality is creating a new wave of. Let's go to the last slide, Adi. So what are the issues that need to be advocated for? Well, almost most of the municipalities in South Africa have got public participation policies that are in place. And so the new normal requires municipalities to reconsider their public participation policies. Adi, can you follow me? Can you hear me?
Yes, Mike, we can hear you.
All right. So the new normal requires that municipalities will have to reconsider their public participation policies in response to the current situation. The second thing that we need to advocate for is that we need to begin to relook at the indicators of participation, in particular the feedback mechanisms, because this has been the weakest link in the public participation process. The feedback mechanism has been very, very weak. Well, it's becoming very clear that the issue of public participation needs to be resourced. During the budget reviews, the issue of participation cannot be left alone. Let me conclude by saying, and asked a very difficult question, whether public participation as is now, is it not creating a false expectation? Are communities not made to suck a dummy with the hope that they are participating? When you can't influence the budget, what is the point of participating? Are we not made to suck a dummy and made to believe that we're participating when we're not? I'm raising this critical issue because we need to. Let's go to the next slide. And let me encourage people to visit our Twitter, our Facebook, our YouTube, and see the work that Planet is doing. Let's get to the last slide. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks, Mike. Mike and Pumeza, if you could keep your video on for just a few minutes, and then I can pose a quick few questions. Maybe kind of the very obvious question to you, Pumeza, first to start off with, and two questions I'll ask you. So one is just, what is the future of this campaign? Where is it going to go? And in those instances where I think Charlton also mentioned that like there are some metros that are still struggling to respond or build the relationship. I forget which ones, I think it might be Joburg or Cape Town. But just in those instances, what tools and strategies will the campaign use to hold these particular metros or municipalities to account?
Thanks, Adi, for that question. And you probably know why I'm smiling at the response. I think right now, the priority for Asivikelane is just to ensure that no residence is left vulnerable because of where they find themselves. And I think at the heart of it, Mandisa touched on it, that this is people's homes. Informal settlements are homes. This is where people live in, and they don't have any other alternative. And so the first, what we're focusing on now is the immediacy. What does it, how do we ensure that there is service delivery for residents of informal settlements? The next thing that I think all I think all the organizations that are part of Asivikelane, they want to get to a point where we deal with the informality, we deal with informal settlements, that we get to a point where we don't find too many residents sharing communal toilets. How that looks like, it's going to be shaped by the future. But I think what we are pushing for, this is going to cause us to think differently about how we budget for informal settlements. This is going to force us to think differently about what type of legislation we put in place to deal with service delivery issues in informal settlements. This is going to force us to think differently as to how is money spent. And so right now, we're hoping that a lot of the lessons that we get inform that conversation. And I think, as I said, this is a campaign that started 3 months ago, but really these are conversations that are happening to say, what does the long term look like? Because if we sort out and we deal with COVID in the next year, we're not going to go back and protest on the streets and still fight for the most basic services. So to answer your question, Israq, right now, we're focusing on basic services, but the conversation around the future and how it looks like, we all know we want to get to a point where we don't have this informality. But how that looks like, it's going to be informed by the different views and the different conversations that Asivikelane is currently holding.
Thanks, Pumeza. And Mike, on your side, I mean, this idea of public participation being a myth or reality, I mean, you do emphasize the issue what Pumeza also just raised around the budgeting process. Is there any good concrete example where there is a strong connection between communities, ward councillors, budgeting process that we could rely on? I think all of us are looking for some kind of precedent or example that we could use where this has been done and can be used as a best case practice.
Well, some years back, we tried participatory budgeting in Makhado municipality. Unfortunately, the politics just messed it up. But part of the intervention was to test the Brazilian model and contextualize it in South African model as to whether communities in the far-flung areas, in the informal settlements, in the rural areas of Makhado, can begin to influence the budget. And we wanted to start with 5% really of the budget to see whether that can be done. We had gone several steps. Unfortunately, the politics disorganized us. But I am quite worried that to the extent that communities are not able to influence the quality of the budget and the quality of the services, it's very worrisome. I am almost certain that none of communities in informal settlements that use chemical toilets or communal toilets have been consulted about the quality of that service. None of them would have agreed. I doubt if any of them would have said, thank you very much, we appreciate communal toilets to be shared by 20, 25 families. None of them would have. You know, so that's why I go back to an argument whether public participation is a myth or a reality. Are we made to suck a dummy and made to feel that we are being consulted, we're being engaged with, when in fact decisions and deals have already been made? And that's my critical point about the issue of public participation. So obviously all of us are looking forward to best practices and to make sure that communities have an influence in the kind of services that they need. And I doubt very much, if I live in Stretla or Herigwala informal settlement or Kaelisha informal settlement, surely if my needs and my expectations are not taken into consideration and I'm made to suck a dummy, and I keep on saying it, because what is happening is communities are made to suck a dummy, and they feel that their stomach, you know, when you suck a dummy, you feel like it's very artificial. You know, it makes you like it's better than nothing. In fact, there's nothing. There's nothing. There's absolutely nothing about sucking a dummy. So it's important that if government has to become partners with civil society, with communities, begin to take into consideration and absolutely consider the views of society. You know, people who live in informal settlements are best placed to tell us how they feel about their situation. You know, no one else. And so when we don't open up our ears and listen to the plight and the feelings and the hopes and the aspirations of those people, we'll definitely miss it. And once more, I argue, is public participation a myth or a reality under the circumstances? Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. Pumeza and Mike, just stay on the camera, and I'm going to ask Charlton and Mandisa also to come on. We are running out of time, but perhaps there's a chance for one last kind of question, probe, comment to all the speakers. And this is a kind of a question that's coming across quite a lot of threads in the question and answer group. That has land and housing really become so commodified now, and basic services, and that we don't have sufficient models for collective management? And what will it take, you know, going forward, especially using the context of COVID-19, to build a new form of solidarity between civil society organizations, between community-based organizations, in order to take that particular step forward? So any kind of ideas or thoughts or inputs you have, final inputs you have towards that particular process? How do we use this momentum to its best impact? What will it take to change the status quo and move away from that dummy in the mouth, Mike, and to get to the genuine part of like engagement between citizens and government institutions, where we don't have to pull in Mandisa every time we have to go to court?
Yeah. I think it's very clear. The legislation is very clear, and we all know what needs to be done. There are no shortcuts to these processes. We just have to invest time and effort into them. You know, this requires experts, facilitators, experts, conflict managers, because there are conflicts in community. So you need experts, people who understand community dynamics, to be the ones who will assist in mediating between the state and its citizens. So there are no shortcuts. It can't be that you know, for 1 or 2 days you call people in a public meeting and say we have consulted. Not at all. It's a long and a tedious process. And that is why organizations such as PLANEC, DAG, FSCs, and many others similar to these ones play that critical role in becoming shock absorbers, in making sure that they become, you know, they play the role of facilitation. So my advice, there is no shortcut. It can be done. It has been done. You know, it's all the efforts that needs to be put into this process.
Great. Charlton?
Thanks, Adi. I think the comment that I wanted to make to this one is one of the things that we've learned as the Alliance over time is because our process really pushes for that engagement with government. We even push to formalize this through the signing of MOUs, MOAs, and all these kinds of things. And it always reminds me of something one of our national leaders says, Rose Molokwane. She wants this meaningful participation, right? And the thing that we've learned over time is that, and it's a bit hectic to say this, but your participation, that's why I like what Mike was saying about this dummy story. When your participation can directly impact budget spend by government, then you're in the game. And so this other thing that Mike reminded me of about the IDP process, for example, and saying that's often the thing that gets said about how informal settlements participate and get into this process. And our informal settlement communities are consistently telling us this doesn't work well for them. And one of the things we've been pushing for at the very, and at the moment we're looking at how we do this inside of the big metros, is push for this structured engagement where communities, informal settlement communities, their community-based data, their inputs inform government spend. So that it's not just tick the box participation or whatever the case might be, but it actually ends up with something real on the ground as well. So that practical partnership, and we realize that money needs to be attached to this and there needs to be that link. So that's one of the ways that we're saying we can influence this process. And a very practical way we're looking at is when the municipalities release their budgets and ask for comments. One of the ways we can really address this is by organizing ourselves and communities in such a way that the response doesn't come from 5,000, 6,000 individuals commenting on a city budget. Informal settlements start commenting on the informal settlement part of the budget and actually putting some real weight behind it, backed up by things like a civic Elani or our own informal settlement profiling and enumeration information. So that's one of the things I can see.
Thanks, Charlton. Mandisa?
Just to add to the responses already given, I think, Eddie, municipalities at this point, actually all levels of government, together with civil society and other actors are being required to really begin acting on a different vision. In the urban context, it's one that dislodges land from having purely market value to really deepening what this would mean in terms of, as we know, land having social value, historical and personal value. And I think that if we are to begin to disrupt those notions of finite or limited understanding, we'll get closer to thinking about how we can expand access beyond, whoever has the highest bid having access. We know this crisis has revealed that approaching land and indeed housing in that manner is not sustainable, and also basic services in that matter is not sustainable. And what it has resulted in is short-term kind of bandaging of the problem, and that kind of bandaging being very expensive. So it doesn't even assist in terms of from an economical point of view. So I think that if we are to be serious about, what to do going forward for the next couple of years, it's about using this moment to interrogate what are our values, who really has been excluded, and how do we ensure that they belong. And that has got implications from access to land, access to housing, as well as access to basic services, which are not temporary bandages in terms of, your temporary kind of solutions, but really some solutions that are dignified and sustainable.
Pumeza? Thanks, Mandisa.
Thanks, Adi. I think just to reinforce what all the panelists have said is that informal settlements residents have been speaking. That's why we have all these amazing organizations doing this work. And finally, it's on the onus of really improving that back and forth engagement to say, what do we do about it? And I think for me, this is a moment for us to really deal with informal settlements and their informality. And obviously with Civic Elani, we are focusing on informal settlements right now, but informality does extend to people in backyards, and how we really deal with issues that force people to be in informal settlements in the first place. And so this is forcing us to really rethink that, but to really, as I think Mandisa is saying, for municipality and our government institution to have a reimagined mandate of how does that look like. And for us to do that, it needs to be technical. Our policies and our legislation needs to be very clear in terms of where we are and where we're going. We know right now we want to ensure that people have the most basic services so that their risk of contracting the virus and also other health-related issues that a lot of these organizations have been talking about for years are limited. But how do we ensure that our communities are safe right now? But in the long term, we ensure that we deal with the informality. We deal with the fact that our communities have to share one toilet amongst hundreds of people. And then lastly, we're not dealing with it if we're not putting the right money where it should be going. And I think there's a lot of conversation about how we budget for informal settlements, how we budget for basic services, and how that money is protected itself, and also how we monitor if where we're going is. And for me, those three legs is what COVID and the crisis has shown us, is that organizations have always been willing to engage, but it's really allowing us to collaborate on a variety of work and campaigns, which shows that everyone sees there's different angles to addressing the issue of informal settlements, and encouraging the platforms to engage in that, for me, is how we're going to address the long-term issues that our informal settlements face.
Thanks, Pumeza. So firstly, just to thank all the speakers now, and by no means I'm in any position to kind of summarize this rich discussion and inputs in any eloquent ways, but perhaps just 3 or 4 comments from my side. Just to start with the idea, I think Mandisa, you brought it on, and it kind of really picked its momentum on the fact that language really matters, and the fact that we have to stop speaking about top structures and these kind of things in these abstract terminologies, but actually recognize the agency that goes behind building those particular homes that people live in. And I remember from years back in the Marikana court case, this issue of defining the home came up very squarely in the courts of like, you know, a tent is also a home for a person that's homeless and living on the street. So I think that issue of language matters is really important, how we, not just in civil society organization, but also government deals with the issue of what we term and what we call things. The second, obviously, is the fact that, like, I think there's context that really matters, and context not just nationally, but context between informal settlements. And I think, Charlton, you highlighted that issue quite squarely, that different densities, different informal settlements have very specific peculiarities that require very particular responses. And then Mike also contributed to that public participation isn't just a blanket statement. It can only work when the specific engagements and in-depth engagements happen on specific issues that leads to very specific allocations, either on budgets or on actions. And that's informed really by the context in which people are surrounded and how they respond to those particular things. I think the other thing that I've really picked up is the issue of legislation and something that you brought up, Pumeza, that at this particular moment dealing with the crisis, money is not the problem. It's really about how to make it happen, how to get the implementation right. So in that sense, there's a lot of different models that not just myself has picked up, but also in the chat that we've picked up from the questions from the audience, that self-management is one of the key instruments that has to be used as legislation moves forward. It cannot be done without government thinking that they have control over the resources, and that control is going to translate itself into some kind of positive interventions without having a very strong both relationship, a trusting relationship, but also a sense of self-management by the communities that are going to inhabit or be part of that particular program. And then the last thing, I think, which again resonates in all of the presentations for me quite a lot, especially when it comes from Mike and Pumeza, is that the values that underpin these particular development really matter. Unless and until government institutions and community members have the same value, we can fight it out in court, we can pull our teeth out, it won't really help till we get to see them eye to eye on the same kind of values where people's agency and their homes are recognized. And the fact that like land is recognized as a huge, huge linchpin in being able to unlock people's agency, people's economic ability, people's social ability, people's ability to be able to engage, not just as citizens, but also engage around broader debates around our democracy and so on. So just to say to the speakers, firstly, thank you guys so much for making the time. I know you guys are on endless Zooms, and I see you very often on those endless Zooms. but it really means a lot that you guys made the time to come and contribute to this debate. To all the participants that have heard the debate and posed the questions, your questions are not lost. There are many questions that we've picked up, including questions related to backyarding and engagements that people want around if they're facing evictions, or have further questions around de-densification, around civic elani, around public participation. There's a host of questions, and we're happy to link you up to each of the speakers and divert those calls, but also use this as a way of translating it into the next webinar that will probably be hosted over the next like 4 to 5 months. We will translate the proceedings of this seminar into an urban land bulletin of some sort, which documents this particular discussion and particularly the tensions that come out of it, so that it can be both documented for each of the organizations that are on the panel, but also the attendees, so that they can take it forward and hopefully use it in some ways to kind of put some additional pressure on government institutions to take some of these processes forward. And then lastly, just to thank my colleagues from DAG, Kirida, Ryan, who really helped support it, and the tech company Kilowatt to helping us put this thing together. Thanks, guys. And that's basically it. Thank you, guys. Have a lovely week ahead.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Adi.
Thank you so much. Lovely.
Thank you, Adi. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.